Okay, so now we're on question 3, and we are starting to think about how structure questions work. So the first thing to notice is we're now looking at the whole of the text that they give us. We're not just looking at a few lines. So we are moving from looking at a few keywords and phrases to actually figuring out how all the details that the authors use, the language device and everything like that, how has it all come together to create a story. So it tells us a little bit of context too, that this text is taken from the opening of a novel, so we've got a little bit of context to it. And the question that it asks us, and this question's identical every single time, how has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? So keywords being there, structure, interest, and basically you the reader. So we're looking at the structure, so the entire text, and we are trying to think about how that interests you as a reader. So they're not asking you to think about other audiences, they are just thinking about you as a reader, which means that you're mostly looking at your own opinion. So when we are trying to break this down and think about what we need to do, one of the key things is looking at the journey that they take you through in the text. Now, if you think about when you've done your own creative writing, we taught beginning, middle, and end. We are doing a similar kind of approach when it comes to looking at a question, and it actually tells you this in the suggested comments at the bottom. So it tells us that we might want to focus on what the author focuses on at the beginning, how and why the writer changes that focus, and any other structural features that interest you. So they are trying to prompt you, they are trying to tell you that you need to look at how that story starts and where it moves to. Now it's 8 marks, so we're writing about 3 to 4 paragraphs, so a really easy way to structure it is what happens at the beginning, where does the focus move to, and how does the particular extract end. So now that we understand the question, the first thing we need to do is actually look at the text and remind ourselves what is the structure, what has the author done, how has the author started it. So if we just look at the first paragraph, that's always a good place to start. So if we read it, it was a cold grey day in late November, the weather had changed overnight when a backing wind brought a granite sky and mizzling rain with it. And as we continue reading that, everything in there for the most part is just describing the weather and then a little bit of introducing this coach that they're in. So if we were trying to do a quick little summary of what's happening there and we think about it, what they are doing there is just setting the scene, which is no different from when you're doing your own creative writing. When you do a piece of story writing, one of the first things you usually do, although not always, is set the location and describe the scene. The author's doing the same thing. So when we come to talking about what the author's trying to do, we're looking for things that you might do in your own writing. So one point we could talk about is setting the scene, and specifically, they are talking about the weather. And we can take that further when we're doing these little annotations, and we can think, well, what is the weather? Is it sunny? Is it miserable? And if you look at it, we've got mizzling rain, granite sky, cold, clammy. There's a lot of negative language there, a lot of language describing the weather in a poor way. And usually there's a reason behind that. Because if you were thinking you're about to write this story, this really happy story where wonderful things happen in it, are you going to describe the weather as being horrible? You're not, are you? So if the author's describing the weather as being horrible, that starts to raise questions for you as a reader. Why are they describing the weather as being horrible? Is it because something bad's about to happen? Is it because the characters in the story are experiencing something horrible or something already bad has happened? So it starts to set the tone for you as a reader, and tone's a really good word to use for this. Just make sure you describe what the tone actually is. Is it a sad tone? Is it a happy tone? Okay, so now that we've had a look at analysing the text, we are going to start looking at how do you actually answer one of these structure questions. Now this table that I'm going to use now will be at the bottom of the page in the useful tools section. There are a lot of ways to answer this question. Again, you might have been taught a different way, you might like a different way. This is just one way that you can answer the question. So as with the other tables that we use in these guides, in the actual exam you might not have time to fill in a big table. You can't just start drawing it, you don't have time for that. So in the real exam you might just jot a few bullet points down, or you might not need to do this anyway because it'll just be intuition by that point, you'll just be so used to doing it. But the way this table works, each paragraph is looking at a different section of the text. So we've got the start of the text, paragraph 1, we've got where does the focus go next, paragraph 2, how does the text end, paragraph 3. And hopefully once you get more confident using this table, you'll be able to pick something else out about the text, and that'll be paragraph 4. So the first thing we need to have a look at is, what does the author do? So we are going to use the example we've just had a look at previously, and we're going to talk about how the author uses weather to set the scene. So the author describes the weather in order to set the scene. So that's a good start, but we're missing a few details there. We need to tell them at the start of the text, which it seems very obvious, but you need to make it obvious. You need to tell them where you're taking these from, especially if we're talking about structure. The examiner wants to know you've got an understanding of where you're getting the information from. So at the start of the text, the author describes the weather in order to set the scene. We could also use a quote in there, again, to make sure we're not being vague. So we could write, an example of this is, the rain was mizzling. And that's the first box done. So the next thing we're going to have a look at is, how do they actually do this? So if you think back, you don't have to use any complex terms for this, but if you think back to when you write a story and when you need to set the scene, you should instantly go to using descriptive writing. So the author uses descriptive writing to do this. And then we've also got an example of it being done. We don't have to go too much into the language because it's not a language question, it's a structure question, but it's useful to just touch on it. So the last part, why do they do this? How does it interest you? So this is the part where we're trying to explain, okay, the author started off with a piece of description, they've started by setting the scene. Why have they actually chosen to do this? So as we were discussing when we looked at it in the previous part of the video, the author describes the weather as being miserable to set a tone, and then we need to talk about what that tone actually is. So the author describes the weather as being miserable to set a tone. The tone that this creates is a sad or miserable tone. As the description goes on, it even suggests that the weather might be dangerous. So we've opened up the discussion. The next part is, well, again, we've still not said why have they done this. So this makes me think as a reader why the author would want to create a miserable tone. And so I start to ask questions about what has happened previously to the characters in the story, or perhaps what is about to happen. And there what we've done is explained how this prompts us to start looking more deeply at the text and make us want to carry on reading. You could even put a little comment at the end by raising questions about what will happen later. The author has engaged my interest. And no matter what point you're looking at, if there are questions that are raised, even if the more obvious questions, like if it mentions a character is suffering from an illness or a character is worried about something, that raises a question. What illness are they suffering from? What what could go wrong with this illness? Or if they're nervous about something, does it tell you what they're nervous about? Do you have to find out later? When you have questions that you want answering, you are much more likely to carry on reading a text to get that answer resolved. So this was just an example of one paragraph that you might write. Again, you do the same approach for each one, even though the next paragraph you're going to look at, well, what do they do after this? Do they start introducing some characters? It's still the same structure that you're going to use. And once you've done all the table, it's just a case of gluing it all together. Because if we read this, at the start of the text, the author describes the weather in order to set the scene. An example of this is the rain was mizzling. The author uses descriptive writing to do this. The author describes the weather, it just flows all together like that. And eventually you won't need the table, you'll just be able to do it instinctively. But while you are getting used to this, use the table because it will help structure your paragraphs. A lot of people, when they attempt to write about structure, because it's something that I think people struggle with so much, they tend to just shove all the points together in a big massive list, which means they're not getting the room to explain why the author's doing it. And if you're not explaining why the author's using structure or what the effects of that structure is on you as a reader, you are not going to get above maybe 2 or 3 out of 8, which is a massive loss in marks. So when you are doing this, think about the author could have told this story in any way possible, and they've chosen this particular way. If they've chosen to start the story with a nightmare, why have they made that decision? If they've started the story with action straight away, why would they do that? Why have they not started with a description? So have a think about it and go with your opinion, but please don't be vague. Please say something specific about the text and try to use 1 or 2 quotes where you can. Okay.